Let me give you a little background to help you. So a little over 2 years ago, I released The Illusion of Us, which was you could call it my grand jump into all of this.
Yeah.
And then, so I've spent the last 2.5 years writing and researching and putting together what is, The Illusion of Us is sort of like a large introduction to all this stuff. Extraterrestrials, gods, ancient civilizations, conspiracies, suppression. The Stage of Time is the one that I've been really working on to not only talk about, well, this is my opinion based on this, but actually back it up with, well, here's the cuneiform tablet from Mesopotamia that actually directly talks about it. And then other evidence like geologic evidence of these cataclysms during the last ice age, which was known as the Younger Dryas, that destroyed all these civilizations. So this book is gonna break down all of that, and it comes out and releasing it this summer.
Today we've got a great guest called Matthew Lacroix. You've all probably seen him before on many of the big channels on YouTube. I mean, I scratched the surface on a lot of these subjects about the Anunnaki, but you actually dig really deep and you go right. You probably know more than anyone I've come across on YouTube or any expert. So honestly it's a big honour to have you here. I really look forward to this interview.
I don't know if that's true, but I think we both have a good channel. So thanks Andrew for having me on. I appreciate it. We're located across the pond, right? Across the Atlantic right now. Yeah. You're in England. I'm in the United States in Maine. And we're going to sit down and have a nice chat about what's real and maybe what's not real and what's going on in our reality and what's going on in our solar system and galaxy. And, what's the truth between all these lies and all these deceptions that have been taught to us and these doctrines that we've been made to believe. So we're gonna try to separate what's real and what's not. And thanks for that nice intro, Andrew. I have a website, The Stage of Time, that you can find release dates for the latest work that I'm working on. Some of the ancient texts that I discuss and talk about. If you want to see directly things like the Atrahasis and read about a lot of the things that occurred in ancient history, you can find those links directly there. And I've been really working pretty hard in between doing some videos when I can, because I know how important that still is. But I've been working really hard to release my latest book called The Stage of Time, which is going to be a reflection of basically all my work, but more so it's also going to be like an ancient reference guide that I don't believe has been done yet, where you have a compilation of, well, here you have ancient text translations from cuneiform tablets and ancient Gnostic stories that include everything from the Atrahasis and the Code of Hammurabi all the way up through Gnostic writings like the Nag Hammadi scriptures and Book of Enoch. It's gonna have an extensive list of all of these ancient texts, these ancient writings that talk about directly what happened long ago in our past, and gives the clues to weed out what the truth is with some of the misinformation that we've had.
The Code of Hammurabi, that was come across in my research, and that's interesting.
The Code of Hammurabi is one of my favorites. It actually is going to lead to directly tie into when we're going to talk about one of the tablets we're going to discuss called the Era Epic. And there's actually some correlation you'll see in those two that we'll go over. But basically, the Code of Hammurabi is really interesting because people want to know, well, how did things become the way they are? Where did laws come from? Where did the structure to everything come from? Was it just a bunch of people over time developed it and then here we are and it's all part of this natural cycle that just occurs? Or is there a lot more to it? And when you read the Code of Hammurabi, you really get an understanding of that. So what the Code of Hammurabi is, it's actually the largest cuneiform writing tablet in the world. It's a massive, tall, single single stone that they carved all of this writing into. And it basically, Hammurabi was one of the later kings of Babylon. So Babylon was one of these empires in Mesopotamia that was constantly fighting with its neighbor, Nineveh, to the north. And they both had different gods and deities that were represented by them. So Babylon's god was Marduk, and we're going to talk a lot about that. But essentially, what Hammurabi talks about is how he was given divine rulership by some of these names we're going to go over, some of these beings that have identified themselves as gods. He distinctly says that, they picked him, Hammurabi, to be, this shepherder of mankind, and following through, handing down all these different laws and rules that he would use to govern the people. And so when we read all about those, we see where this entire structure came from, and we can see that it's by no means an accident. And the entire fabric of our society, when you look at how things are organized, what people believe in, what they're focused on doing, and what they're governed by, we can trace it back to the very beginning, because that really brings up the big question: is, are we doing what we're supposed to be doing right now?
Am I right to believe it's something to do with Christianity? Has it got the Ten Commandments on it or something like that? And it was 500 years before Christianity.
It's similar in that it's this code that's handed down. It's called the Code of Hammurabi because it's essentially this long list of rules and laws that he was supposed to then use to govern. Now, what makes it interesting is those same laws and rules you also find in other tablets that were much earlier, something like the Instructions of Shuruppak, where you had Ubaratutu, who was a king there, also according to the Sumerian king list that echoes it, talks about how they had to lay down all of the laws and rules, these moral codes, to be continued by the next king, which his son was known as Zayas Suja or Radrahasis, which we're going to go through a bunch of things as well about. But essentially that means is that these kings, these bloodline ruler ancestors that were chosen, and that's the word I really want to emphasize, these chosen bloodlines ancestors, they had to keep carrying down these rules and laws so that society would follow them very closely to keep order, to keep control and order within our society. And so if and we can jump right in, and we can go right into to one of those tablets that talks about that. If you want me to jump right into that.
That's great. Yep.
So I wanted to go over some tablets that I've really never talked about. We're gonna do 2 readings today of tablets that I've never done a reading for or really talked about that much, because the bottom line is this: so many of the secrets of the past are found in these cuneiform tablets. That means these etched in writing of they essentially took clay and they heated it so that it would turn hard and last essentially for thousands and thousands of years. And by doing that, they could create this form of writing within the clay or sometimes rock that would essentially not erode ever or for a very, very long period of time, so that they could have a message be protected, a message that could be protected long into the future. And that's what these messages are, with the importance of what happened long ago, with what we can go over, which is basically the idea that there were these megalithic advanced human civilizations that once existed all around the planet. And today, all we have are these small remnants of those that are left. But more importantly, what we find is this continuation of building by their ancestors later that tried to accomplish what they did, but they weren't able to because they didn't have the understanding and the knowledge. And so essentially what we're about to read here in a second is that that knowledge and that information so that they knew how to do those types of buildings, how to create this type of kingship model so that they could structure society and create empires and great civilizations. How do you do that? Is that just something that, someone comes up with and is like, hey, this is a good idea how to do this? Or is it, more importantly, is it a very strict set of commands and rules that get relored over and over again? And that's what you see when you read things like the Sumerian king list and what we're about to read in a second. You see this over and over and over again, they have to keep lowering kingship into different civilizations because they're destroyed through things like war or cataclysms or whatever occurs, and they have to keep reestablishing this model on Earth. That's very important for them to have this certain model be followed here. So the tablet that I'm going to start with, that a lot of people might not have heard of, but I highly recommend it, is called the Epic of Eridu tablet. Okay, so Eridu was considered in Mesopotamia. And we're talking about a timeline that's, according to the Sumerian king list, is over 200,000 years ago. Okay, so we're throwing the timeline of human civilizations and what occurred in our planet, which we're going to go into and talk on a more wide scale basis. But we're going to go into where all that came from and what the real history of it all is. So the Epic of Eridu tablet talks about how the first city on Earth where kingship was lowered and civilization arose from. We're gonna read directly from that about how that came to be. The Epic of Eridu tablet. I'm going to read just a segment of it. You'll see if you read the Sumerian king list, it's strikingly similar. And it starts by saying, when the royal scepter was coming down from heaven, the august crown and the royal throne being already down from heaven, the king regularly performed to perfection the august divine services and offices, and laid the bricks of those cities in pure spots. They named by name in allotted half-bushel baskets. The firstling of the cities, Eridu, she gave to the leader Nunamud. The second, Bad Tabira, she gave to the prince and sacred one. The third, Lacroix, she gave to Palisog. The fourth, Sipar, she gave to the gallant Utu. The fifth, Sharupak, she gave to Ansud. On, Enlil, Enki, and Ninhursag had the gods of heaven and earth swear by the names of On and Enlil. So when you read those names, those cities that I just mentioned, Eridu, Bad Tabira, Lacroix, Sipar, Sharupak, all those terms are found in other tablets as well, talking about these cities that are almost not even there anymore. There's such a small amount that remains from this time period that if you were to go out in the desert of Iraq, down in the Fertile Crescent today, some of these remote areas that not many people go to, you can still find Eridu today. You could still find these remnants out in the desert in the sand of this massive complex that was just there, that all it's left now is just windswept sand over this, what looks like what was this huge, massive structure. And it's all that's left of Eridu. And of course, what we're talking about is a city that was built in kingship was descended down to more than 200,000 years ago. Okay. And that's going to be that's the theme of so much of this, is that we have to take our understanding of both which we're going to go into, the influences of those who came here, as well as the age of how far back human civilizations go. And what's amazing is we look around today at, the fact that we have we have cell phones and technology, TVs, and all this wireless and all these things around us. But yet, in many ways, we're less sophisticated than these global civilizations that used to exist are. Not in terms of technology like phones or something like that. This materialistic technology. Their technology was more of an understanding and a wise technology of understanding the electromagnetic grid of our entire Earth, where all these ley line convergence zones were, to build these megalithic temples and these pyramids all around the world. They understood sophisticating building techniques for how to create these massive, perfectly symmetrical and precise walls in places like, if you go down to Tiwanaku and Machu Picchu and Cusco, we can see evidence of these civilizations that were once there that were then destroyed and by cataclysms. And we're gonna read through some of these tablets that discuss some of those cataclysms that occurred. Okay, so let me explain something that I think has been rather lost in our modern society, and it's the hidden symbolism that existed long ago. These, just like we have today, certain words can mean more than one thing. And so if someone's trying to figure out what language and understanding that some other ancient civilization had from long ago, it's very, very easy to misinterpret what they were trying to say, because they often wrote and expressed themselves in a much, much more advanced, wise way than we do today. Unfortunately, they were far more intelligent than we are now, based on the fact that they had connections to information that was much more widely distributed until some of these disasters occurred. And then after this reset button occurred, which you can talk about, a lot of this became lost, but it didn't all become lost. And that's what the Druids represent, and what we're going to go into is that there was information and knowledge that was still carried on by certain civilizations that were passed down to some of these practicing, you could call them pagan societies, that didn't follow modern Christianity or this monotheistic singular God aspect. Now, so that's where all this comes into play. Now, I want to give a little backstory before we jump back into St. Patrick and the Druids. It's going to tie into what we're going to talk about later on too. In the Emerald Tablets of Thoth, these ancient records from Atlantis that he wrote, essentially, right? And then he hid inside the Great Pyramid of Giza, which were then moved later on to Mexico. But what it says in those, he writes about how there were these beings that were pretending to be people, hiding amongst mankind in the shadows, and he called them serpent-headed when their glamour is lifted. Okay, and that representation, as well as there's an Iraqi artifact that looks like this reptilian, scary-looking alien type of thing from Iraq, but it's not actually a reptilian; it's a serpent. Again, a serpent is a reptile, so that's where this comes into play. Serpent-headed. What does that mean? Well, just like we're going to read later, they specifically mention how they called some of these ordainers of kingship, like Hammurabi, they were the shepherds of the black-headed people, right? Does that mean they're black? No, they're black-headed. Just like we see in all these depictions from Egypt of these bird heads and everything, it's what their mind, what was inside their head, what they were represented by. So what would black-headed be? It'd be someone who's completely ignorant and has no knowledge. It's just black. It's empty. That's what those representations were. They were shepherds to the culture, the citizens who were essentially had no knowledge. There was no computers back then. They had no way of learning any of this stuff unless they somehow were royal or had connections to some of these libraries and access to a lot of this information. But back then, they had almost no information. We're talking about after some of these cataclysms. So when Hammurabi, he's part of the post-Diluvian civilizations of Babylon, he was talking about how he's shepherding all of these ignorant, unknowledgeable people, and he's their ruler. Now, getting back to what I said a minute ago in the Emerald Tablets of Thoth, serpent-headed, what does that mean? Well, it means wise and very knowledgeable. So just like you have a society where all these black-headed people, these ignorant people without knowledge are walking around, meanwhile, hidden among them are these what seem like people, but they're actually not really people. They're more like an incarnation of maybe another being that's very, very powerful and wise and has an understanding that none of the other people do. And maybe they even are just a person, but happen to be someone who's extremely knowledgeable and happens to have connections to the ancient ways to understand. So they would be called serpent-headed, because that would represent what their mentality was. And I know that's a hard thing for people to understand, because the serpent and the dragon have been this demonized evil thing all throughout, whereas the eagle has been this symbol of freedom and sovereignty, but it's completely the opposite. And you can see evidence for that all throughout history until this emergence of, the Holy Roman Empire, when religion became very corrupted, and it was a lot of these terms, heaven, hell, the eagle, the serpent, they were all turned into their backwards meanings and inverted, and everything became all confused. And before we knew it, things like the symbol of the serpent and the dragon became associated with evil, when they actually represent knowledge, balance, and essentially creative higher consciousness. They are the fundamental principles that separates us essentially from being a barbaric materialistic warmongering type of person, because we're essentially humans. So like, what is our nature? Is our nature violent, or has that just been something that we've been conditioned for to become? Because when you truthfully look at it, the human race would, if it was left to its own means, would much more, with the right influences, would just as much turn into an enlightened, sophisticated civilization as they could also be conditioned into a warmongering, violent civilization. And that's what happened to us. So getting back to what I was originally talking about with the Druids and St. Patrick, the Druids represented one of the last societies on the planet that still practiced the ancient Egyptian and Gnostic wisdom, which connected all the way back to Atlantis and the idea of understanding consciousness and the universe around you, and that the physical body is just an avatar for your consciousness and spirit. And so they were practicing all of that knowledge still. At the same time, the Romans were becoming extremely powerful and influential, the Holy Roman Empire. And St. Patrick's father was a Roman himself. So St. Patrick was tasked by the church. Of course, the word saint should be used very loosely in this case. So St. Patrick was tasked to go to Ireland, Scotland, and England, and Wales, and rid all the serpents from that area. And of course, like you said, there's never been any snakes that live there. This is just a way to symbolically demonize them, even though that term is a term of endearment if you actually know what it really means. Serpent, it means wise and knowledgeable. So St. Patrick, we're celebrating, especially in the United States, everyone just gets drunk and thinks it's this wonderful holiday about Irish pride, but we're essentially celebrating the cleansing of an entire society where they exterminated large amounts of people, killed them, and then others they forced out to leave and go somewhere else. So that's what St. Patrick's Day represents. It's one of the last societies on the planet that still had connections to what was called the old religion. This knowledge of the ancient past that had become like a war on information over time, essentially.
If you actually speak to the Welsh, because that was a lot of Druid culture, and you ask them what happened, the Druids actually got their knowledge from someone underground. Now, King Arthur in the Welsh legend came from underground also. Like the Incas as well, they were supposed to come from underground to start the Inca.
That's right.
And
you want me to touch on the whole underground aspect? There are a lot of indications if you read. There's a lot of writings that talk about this extensive underground network that exists all throughout the world, but not like we think. I don't think the Earth is hollow, but I do think that they've cleared out very large areas and they've gone down and they exist in addition in non-physical forms in what's called the underworld. Okay. So when you mentioned the Inca, they have a story of Lake Titicaca about how Viracocha, their god, came out of Lake Titicaca and created them. And then just like you said, all around the world, there's all these stories about how beings came from, or knowledge came from under the ground and then came to them, and then they came to acquire all this.
Alexander the Great sealed Gog and Magog in a tunnel underground somewhere. Sounds like something underground's going on. And then you've got Agartha, you've got Hyperborea, you've got Ultima Thule, you've got all these descriptions of underground civilization.
The North and South Pole is very interesting, and the whole underground thing is connected to the idea where how would you be able to control something like the electromagnetic energy of our planet, or control where some of the idea of a pole shift occurring, or where the energy centers are. The North and South Pole, where a lot of this no-fly zone, strange things like when Admiral Byrd flew over the North Pole and then spoke about how there was a strange entrance that he saw, and then all that information that led to that suppression of that information. What essentially has been happening is there's a lot of things behind closed doors that society just never gets to see. Things down in Antarctica, things in the North Pole, connected all the way back to ancient technologies and some of these secret societies. We're basically living in a reality that if people knew the truth about some of these things, it would almost seem like something right out of science fiction. It's very, very bizarre, but essentially what it comes down to is there's a long, much older history than we realize here with advanced civilization or civilizations that came here long ago and imparted all of this knowledge that came from heaven down to earth. And of course, the term heaven and hell became a very confused term within religion, but really it breaks down to something like hell is equated to the underworld, where we're going to go over the idea that, well, what if beings are non-physical that exist in other dimensions? Would the underworld be a place of demons and where evil comes from? Or is there also more to the story than that? And that's what essentially we're going to come to, is that if this may help people understand, there's an obsession about balance here. It's always about balance, a balance of energy, as above, so below. That essentially explains everything. If you have, and there is evil that exists in the lower dimensions that's down there that is held back by some of those who protect it, they say. But if you do have that, then you also need benevolent forces down there, beings that can balance that. The same thing is true for the higher dimensions. You can have evil that exists there, but it also has to be balanced by good. So there's different beings that essentially were able to conquer these laws of reality, and were able to take on these different roles in these different places to manipulate reality, to create whatever reality they wanted to, and to also be able to control and harness energy, free energy, like Nikola Tesla figured out, which is essentially exactly the same thing about all these ancient pyramids all over the planet on these ley lines. It's always about energy, because energy is essentially what is the driving force behind everything. It's what continues something living without dying through entropy. Okay. And so what it comes down to is essentially these beings that came here long ago, they call themselves the Anunnaki, and they took over a lot of these roles within our reality and within religion, becoming essentially like angels and demons. But at the same time, there are other beings, other sentient beings that are in the universe as well, because we're talking about such a vast amount of space and planets and life that exists. It can't help but just create sentient life, because if you think about it, the intelligent design that's behind everything in the universe is a design that forces this combination of nature coming together with this intelligence that exists already, this conscious intelligence that exists everywhere, to create the environment where life just can't help but come to be. And that, I think that's the missing point that we need to look at all across the galaxy and the universe, is that there's likely probable life, especially when you look at things like the Drake equation. There's probable life all over the galaxy and universe. And there's the probability that sentient life was able to develop in those places means that even if, with all the disasters and planetary things that can happen, there still would be hundreds, if not thousands, of advanced sentient civilizations that exist in our galaxy alone. And I know that sounds like something that would be impossible, but that's based on the mathematical probability when you take into account all of the different seeds and the different things that go into life, carbon and the amount of nitrogen and oxygen, all these things that can come into play. How abundant are those throughout their entire, galaxy and universe? And truthfully, we may be this species that's been closed off from knowing the truth because we're so primitive and we're still developing at such a state that it would cause complete chaos if we learned the truth. Yeah, so if you go into and you read things like the Atrahasis and you read things like the Enuma Elish, you see that there have been all these different experiments to create, like a perfect being, a perfect human here. And it was all this trial and error, and what, according to all those tablets, we were essentially created to be far more superior than we were supposed to be in the image of the Anunnaki. That's what they call themselves. And we're supposed to look exactly like them, but yet fit for the place that we're in, smaller, because they don't come from here. That's why they don't fit living in a place like this. Whereas we're designed specifically for Earth. We are a person that's based on the electromagnetic gravity of this planet. We're here, we're of the size that we should be, but that wasn't always the case. Like, this whole idea behind these fallen angels and this crossbreeding of Nephilim with all these giants that ruled as kings, these ancestral bloodline kings were much, much taller than we are now, and they lived for a much extended amount of time than we do. So we're this different stage of humans that's come from so many different groups and different epochs where things have happened, where we used to live for a very, very long time. We used to be much taller. And over time, there was even tampering and manipulation done because of how intelligent we were getting, how aware we were becoming. And it talks about how we were actually genetically downgraded, and these chakra centers inside us were unplugged so that we wouldn't be able to connect to our higher self. And we would be trapped in this internal state of lower energy so that we could essentially be controlled here.
So the only way to do it now is through taking psychedelics?
Well, you can do it in many different ways. Psychedelics are one way to do it, but another way you can do it is through connecting to the natural world and meditation and getting in tune with your higher state of energy. And you have to release all these toxins that are inside our body, cleanse the body and the mind, and then the rest will follow. And then you'll be able to essentially connect to this Trinity that it's always talked about in religion, connecting to this Father, Son, and eternal soul. What it really comes down to is this idea of where we have this physical body, we have this consciousness, and then there's this intelligence of the universe that is called God or the prime creator. So essentially this Trinity is the body becoming healthy to the point where it can reach an optimal state, the mind becoming cleansed and freed of all of its burdens to be clear, to reach a higher state, and then connecting to this higher consciousness intelligence of the universe. That's this Trinity, this connection of all three different types of energies that once they come together, we become this ascended being, like Gandhi or Buddha, all these different things, these beings who managed to ascend to a higher state. And that's the whole game here. That's the entire game here. Like back to the Druids, there was an organized attempt to rid all the knowledge of how we could reach that higher state, to keep us in a lower state permanently, to keep us in a lower state of energy, just to be used just as energetic slaves here. And essentially that's why our entire model of reality, after some of these disasters occurred, became so focused around control and war, because we entered in this time period when we were no longer being influenced by those who were trying to help us. We were actually being controlled by some of the more malevolent beings that we can go into.
You talked about the Anunnaki, which I presume are the Anunnaki, what I call the Anunnaki.
Yeah, they call themselves the Anunna.
Right.
The Sumerians call them as a third person. The Sumerians called them the Anunnaki, which meant those from Anu who sent from heaven to earth, or those from heaven to earth came, essentially. But they call themselves the Anunna. That's their actual name, and I believe that they're a combination of, like, when you look at something like the story of the Dogon with the Nomo, and how they talk so much about how they came from Sirius, and you look at the Nomo and the connections that the fish suit has back to Enki, and some of these beings that are part of this different time period of Pisces and represented through fresh water. You see that, oh, okay, well, that Oannes is Enki, okay, and that's the Nomo. That's the same thing. And what that connects back to, and also looking at the pyramids, how they're aligned to these different Sirius and Orion, it makes a lot of sense when you start thinking that however they got here, maybe it must have been through some kind of a wormhole or a Stargate, because I think linear travel from a place like Sirius or Orion would essentially be impossible. We're talking about distances that are so enormous that we have to get past a linear mindset and look more into, well, these are advanced beings that learned how to conquer reality itself, okay? And that is something that is mind-boggling to consider, is that, yes, they were once physical beings, but they realized how to conquer that. And we can go through tablets that actually directly talk about that too.
Just now, I'd like to go back to about 2,000 to 3,000 years ago. Something major happened. It's described in the Amarna tablets. It's described in the Heibaru as they came and destroyed civilization. And
so that's an interesting comment or question, because it's rather complicated. It looks like, if you look into the records, especially something like the Emerald Tablets of Thoth, he talks about how during the time of Atlantis, before 10,000 years ago, there were, these global civilizations that were extremely advanced, advanced in terms of understanding energy and having pyramids and temples all around the world that had certain kind of rock that was quartz rich so that it could resonance with a high vibrational frequency, so they could reach these incredible states of consciousness. Because what I believe, based on what I've looked at, is that the Anunnaki originally were physical beings. That's why they have to have the Ajiji do, and we're going to read about that as we go on, have the Ajiji do all the physical labor for them. They're like demigods of them. But over time, they learned how to conquer the rules of reality, and then they became non-physical in terms of being able to be interdimensional. They could go between different dimensions and influence so many different aspects of our reality. But at the same time, the Ajinji remained essentially as watchers of our world. And I believe that they're the ones that are probably most connected to what we think of as UFOs. They're tasked as watching and monitoring everything that's going on here, because the Anunnaki actually became separated by time and how we view it. And so time for them became much different than us. So essentially Gigi's purpose is to watch us. So getting back to that, Atlantis was a place where these different temples were erected and they could actually communicate with these gods. That's essentially what these temples were. They were temples that were created, and this massive energy grid all over the planet, they could essentially communicate with these beings, and they could reach the highest states of consciousness to become almost like gods themselves. And it was all this bizarre stuff that we would consider science fiction today, where they actually learned alchemy. I call it alchemy magic, because it really is beyond what is called sleight of hand magic, and it really is like an aspect of manipulating the reality around you, and that became lost over time. But during the time of Atlantis, you had these high priests connecting to these gods, these beings, while at the same time practicing all of these ancient arts through dark and white magic. And what happened is you essentially had a corruption of Atlantis, where they used that power and their technology to essentially help create and further the destruction that occurred on the earth. So, like you say, some of these wars that were occurring were very real, because when Atlantis was destroyed, what you had was this struggle for power after. Okay. Atlantis was destroyed through a combination of their own, like I said, their own technology and manipulation, but along with some of these devastating events that were occurring on the earth at the time, which was around the last ice age. But after that happened, there was an attempt to restart a lot of these civilizations around the planet, while at the same time, great empires were rising up, because they were in a different zodiacal time period, and they were all fighting for control. At this time, you had all of these gods fighting over control for who could be supreme. All of the rules had been essentially dissipated that had existed long ago with these global civilizations. And it was like anarchy, chaos on our planet for essentially like the last 7,000 years. It's been just complete war and anarchy on our planet. And that's why so much has been lost and destroyed, along with the disasters that caused it. So I think there was two things going on. There were actual physical wars being fought between the civilizations on the planet that were essentially being ruled through different gods for supremacy. They were all just fighting each other, okay? And that's one of the reasons why I think kingship also kept having to be moved. Because I think some of these places were just completely destroyed or taken over, and then that kingship model, that control of governing was lost, so they had to re-lower it again, because they kept trying to create this perfect world. While at the same time, this control over our reality here, creating a false paradigm, keeping the human race enslaved in this lower vibrational energy through war. When you read about ancient people like the Hopi or the Maya, they talk about the Pleiadians. They talk about the Seven Sisters and how there were other beings that were involved as well in our timeline, trying to, at the same time, help humanity and break us out of this illusion here and help educate us and enlighten us. And they maybe even been involved with some of the seeding that occurred here long ago. But the point is, they were essentially, in some ways, in this war in heaven, this higher dimensional war with what the Anunnaki were doing to humanity, keeping us enslaved here, essentially. And we can go over that as we go on, but essentially the war in heaven was this war of these different beings who kept fighting over wanting our future to go a certain way. And so as above, so below was represented in the physical realm of Earth with all of this war and chaos that was occurring here, with civilizations all fighting here, because it was like chaos in the heavens and the underworld. So it was reflected here on the planet, and that's still happening right now. That's why all this war has been going on. If you look at places like Libya, you can see some of this this glass that's been formed from some incredible amount of heat that occurred out there. And like you said, some of these ancient cuneiform stories talk about how there were these devastating wars. What does that mean? Could there have been ancient nuclear technology used? Very possibly. We don't even know the extent of how bad the destruction was, but you could see how if they were fighting and using, and there was advanced technologies that, only came to be much later on, like some kind of a nuclear weapon, you could see how something like that could totally wipe out an entire city, and they would have to lower kingship again and restart over in another place. Because I do think that at that time, long ago, it was still complete chaos, and a lot of these things were happening. But later on, after the reset occurred, I think they took a much less of a role, and in many ways maybe even left. And so humanity sort of had these temporary rulers through these secret societies and elite families, who then perpetuated this same model of war and chaos right up until today. And I think that's why you see families like the Rothschilds that are so connected to these bizarre quotes, like saying, if my sons didn't want war, there would simply be none. Quotes like that are so scary and bizarre, and they show us that all of these terrible events that are occurring here are actually manipulated and created to try to steer things in a certain direction or keep us in a certain state. So yeah, we have this long history of destruction that may go far beyond what we can even imagine, especially if you look at a place like Mars and, another planet nearby where radioactive isotopes have been found all over the planet, like covering the entire planet. And there was this sudden massive event that occurred there where the entire atmosphere was blown out and everything, and all the liquid water evaporated into space, and it destroyed this whole planet. Was that remnant of ancient nuclear weapons?
Like a lot of people say, they left at the end of the Cold War. What scares me, Matt, is we seem to, in the past, it would have been sci-fi to a lot of people trying to describe this. Now we can understand it because a lot of the technology that was used in the past is used now. So
yeah, that's right.
We're getting very close to the part where they destroyed itself.
Well, I think it's actually more. It's more complicated than that, because there's a lot of people and whistleblowers that have come out and said during things like the Cold War and during these really, really tense times when the United States or Russia or whatever location may have wanted to or even did try to launch nuclear weapons against the other country, and then something strange occurred where the button wouldn't work or became disconnected and there was no signal, and they literally couldn't launch these weapons of mass destruction that would have led to this drawn out war that could have cost billions of lives and been much more destructive than people realize. That's showing you that there are other forces involved here beyond what we see and what we know, who are trying to help guide us so we don't destroy ourselves and end up as another reset that has to start over again from the very beginning. And if we can get into that, I would like to read a tablet that talks about that destruction that occurred here and this reset that happened. Because essentially you had, when I mentioned, you had a situation where advanced technology was all over the planet, these global civilizations. There was these giants that were the ancestral remnants of the Anunnaki through crossbreeding that were like abominations on the earth. There was all this unbalance. And so what did they do? Well, they decided to just reset the entire human civilization and start over again. And that's why kingship was relowered, just like the Sumerian king list says, relowered again after this destructive event occurs. So what I want to read is a tablet called the Era Epic, okay? And Era is connected to this god named Nergal, who is a god of the underworld, who essentially allows chaos into our realm. He's the guard, like the guardian gatekeeper of that. And it's tablet 1 states, and again, you'll see a lot of these names that we've been talking about right in here. It says, the Anunnaki gods cannot fall asleep for the clamor of humankind. Beasts are overrunning the meadows, life of the land. And when it mentions clamor, it's talking about how we used to have this one language connecting all around the world. And that's why the Tower of Babel is this symbolic representation of when humanity was all divided and languages were all created and we all became a divided race rather than one unified race, okay? O King of all inhabited lands, creator of the world, holder of a sublime scepter, herdsman of the black-headed folk, shepherd of mankind. Lord Era, why have you plotted evil against the gods, to lay waste to the lands and decimate the people? Era made ready to speak and said to Isham, his vanguard, keep quiet, Isham. Listen to what I say as concerns the people of the inhabited world whom you would spare. O vanguard of the gods, wise Isham, whose counsel is always for the best. I am the king of the land. I am the fiercest among the gods. I am warrior among the Ajiji gods, mighty one among the Anuna. I will make Marduk angry, stir him from his dwelling, and lay waste to the people. The warrior Era set out for Babylon, city of the king of the gods. He entered Isalgia, palace of heaven and earth, and stood before him. He made ready to speak, saying to the king of the gods, why has your precious image, symbol of your lordship, lost its brilliance? The king of the gods, Marduk, made ready to speak, saying to Era these words, O warrior Era, concerning that deed you said you would do. Once long ago, indeed, I grew angry. Indeed, I left my dwelling and caused the deluge. When I left my dwelling, the regulation of heaven and earth disintegrated. When Marduk heard this, he made ready to speak, saying to the warrior Era, when I rise from my dwelling, the regulation of heaven and earth will disintegrate. The waters will rise and sweep over the land. Bright day will turn to darkness. Whirlwind will rise, and the stars of heaven will be in chaos. Demons will raise up and seize the land. The gods of hell will rise up and smite down living creatures. Who will keep them at bay till I gird on my weaponry once more? When Era heard this, he made himself ready to speak, saying to noble Marduk, O noble Marduk, when you enter the house, fire cleanses your apparel and you return to your palace. For that time I will govern and keep strong the regulation of heaven and earth. I will go up to heaven and issue instructions to the Ajiji gods. I will go down to the depths and keep the Anunnaki gods in order. So what that is essentially talking about is how they created this destruction on the planet to wipe away all of humanity, to then allow in this agreement so Marduk could rise to become this king of the Anunnaki here on earth, which was why Babylon grew to become such an important place in the world, because Marduk was their chief deity. Okay, and Babylon is a city that spans the pre-Diluvian and continues into the post-Diluvian. That means that Babylon itself is an ancient city that's far older than we know. And a lot of these cultures after the cataclysms had to come back in and rebuild them again, over and over again. In the Nag Hammadi scriptures, the chapter called the Hypothesis of the Archons, which means the rulers, it directly calls them the rulers of our reality, the rulers of the demiurge, meaning they understand that there's a primitive side of the human race that can be essentially perpetuated and controlled to keep us in a lower state. The demiurge represents our lower state, things like war, chaos, material greed, lust, all of these primitive urges that can be perpetuated to keep people in a lower state, because they'll never be able to reach a higher state, like we talked about, unlocking chakras and reaching higher states of consciousness, if they're being ruled by their demiurges of fear and war and chaos, and keeping them in this lower state. And that's the whole game here, Andrew. That's what they're essentially trying to do. It's like a farm of consciousness here to keep us in this chaotic state. That's why things like these symbols were manipulated, so that we wouldn't understand the truth about what they really represent. So I want to bring something up really important right now. When you look at these depictions, like we talked about, this headed aspect, serpent-headed, black-headed. Well, what about these depictions of these Anunnaki in murals all over the world where they have an eagle head, and they're passing along with a pineal gland in their hand with a hand basket? Well, let's go over what that means. Some of them had serpent heads, some of them had eagle heads. And what that essentially meant was, what kind of knowledge were they passing on? The eagle represents essentially the demiurge, war, control, and the material world. So you would essentially be teaching how to create these empires and civilizations based on certain kinds of laws to keep control. That's why they were represented through an eagle head. They were still passing along knowledge, creating powerful armies and controlled, organized civilizations. But at the same time, that's not a type of knowledge that can lead to balance, right? It's a type of knowledge that can lead to unbalance and keeping society in a place that doesn't allow them to reach a higher state, but more traps them in a state where they're always fighting. Like, look at the Roman Empire, just like modern day empires today, like we see with like the United States, that I call the empire with the great eagle that's presented on it. They rule their societies through fear and through keeping them entertained, but not entertained in a way where they would learn something and better themselves. They kept them entertained through violence. It's a war on consciousness, and it's a war on which direction our civilization will go. That's why the eagle and serpent is this battle back and forth. You see so many depictions. Look at the flag of Mexico. It's this eagle holding the serpent. It represents this war of these two sides of, you could call it like almost like the yin and yang of our consciousness. It's the two sides of us. Which way will we go? Are we going to be, like I said, this having our demiurge control us and being controlled through war and conquering? Or are we going to become wise and knowledgeable and balanced and use our creative energy to try to increase our understanding of reality and become a sophisticated civilization? Those two sides were what was the war was about. That's what the war in heaven was essentially about, because there was different sides that wanted different things. And some of them, like Enki and Thoth, they wanted human civilizations to reach higher states of consciousness. Meanwhile, Enlil, Ninurta, Nergal, some of these other figures didn't want human consciousness to reach higher states. So they kept them in this perpetual state of anarchy so that they would never allow to ascend. So essentially you get to places like the United States and all throughout the world, through the Roman Empire, through the Spanish empires, and all these countless empires that have emerged and been at war, they are essentially always get corrupted, this corrupting aspect, and then they often start as a pure place of wanting to be a place of free speech and teaching about wisdom, but they often get corrupted and become a tool for propaganda and evil and war. And that's what we're seeing today with places like, the United States used to be founded on these great principles of our founding fathers, but then became corrupted and taken over through this military industrial complex and different influential families and beings that wanted to control how our future and reality goes. So we essentially have to start over and relearn a lot of this information so that we can understand what is real and what's not real. Okay. And so, so I want to talk about, Andrew, unless you had another question, I wanted to bring up another tablet that explains all of this essentially. Okay. And I've read it before, but I want to read this part again because it's very important. Okay. It's very important to understand how we ended up at where we are today. And that is the tablet 2 of the Atrahasis. It's probably my favorite piece of cuneiform text of all, because what it says is it gives us clues to really what happened and how all this ended up the way it was. And on tablet 2, part of it says, and I'm paraphrasing because I'm jumping in here because it's a very long tablet, but essentially it says, where you went, Enki, you were to undo the chain and set us free. You were in charge of control and holding the balance, but instead you gave wisdom and knowledge to the people. Your creations have become too numerous and despoiled the earth. You imposed your loads on man. You bestowed noise on mankind, language, intelligence, and knowledge. You slaughtered a god together with his intelligence. Let us make far-sighted Enki swear an oath to the end, to create a flood on earth to wipe away all of life. So that's an amazing thing, not only because they're talking about these cataclysms, which I want to talk about really briefly because it's very important, but it talks about this phrase, undo the chain to set us free. All right, now think about that for a minute. If these are physical beings that came here, and they were physical at first, this chain represented them conquering the laws of reality to become non-physical, essentially losing this binding of having to be a physical being that dies and then has to incarnate over again. They essentially conquered those laws, and that's how they were able to conquer our reality. That's what that means. And they reset the entire civilization that was here because it become out of control. It become unbalanced and out of control. And so they wanted to create it over again. But the problem was, after they created civilization again, after this destruction occurred, which I was reading about in the Era Epic, after they had created it over again, it ended up becoming far more unbalanced and controlled than ever before. So what was supposed to be something that was benevolent and was supposed to be good to help the human race ended up being a means which forced us into even more control than ever before. And that's why we lost so much of what we used to have. And what I mean by lost, we're talking about these global civilizations that go from Easter Island up to the Inca of Peru and over in Tiahuanacan in Bolivia, right up through the Aztec and the Maya, up through the Americas, over to places like around the Mediterranean and in Baalbek, Lebanon, and right down through Egypt, along the Nile, and over into Mesopotamia, over into India, right up through Western Turkey, up into Western Russia. This is a massive part of our world who used to have ancient civilizations, like I said, well over 10,000 years ago, that existed all around the planet, that had completely different knowledge and understanding than we did, that were connected to these gods, that were these sages and priests would go to these temples and would connect to them and then would guide the people. So then what happened, like you said, things became extremely unbalanced. The people became very, very wise and knowledgeable, and they ended up using that to their advantage and became powerful, and things got haywire here. And that's what I was talking about with Atlantis. So essentially what they did is they allowed this, or even created this series of cataclysms to essentially wipe everything away and start over. And they were able to do that through the combination of what looks like allowing or timing this comet to hit the northern ice caps, because this was during the last ice age. At the same time, we had what looks like poles shifting and the electromagnetic grid of the earth completely becoming disrupted. So over the course of 800 to maybe more than 1,000 years, there were like these back-to-back disasters that occurred. It wasn't just one disaster. It would be a disaster like the comet hitting the ice caps and having them create a massive flood that led to the extinction of a lot of the megafauna in the Americas, like the woolly mammoth and the dire wolf.
And this is what David Wilcox talks about when he talks about looking at these ancient like rock formations where it looks like a massive flood has happened.
That's right. And so we had this episode where massive floods, things like enormous earthquakes and tsunamis that split open the earth in places and disrupted even some of the land masses. And at the same time, the climate was rapidly shifting, and you had these wildfires that were tearing apart around the globe. That's why when you go to places like Peru and you go to Egypt, you see this scarring and this burning on these monoliths, on these ancient carved stones, which were part of these building practices. You see this scarring that occurred from the combination of this destructive solar activity, because the electromagnetic grid had been disrupted. So all this incoming solar radiation could just pummel the planet, creating wildfires, and the climate was shifting. So what happened? Like Graham Hancock talks about recently, he's done some new interviews that are pretty spot on, I agree with. If you have a sophisticated, advanced civilization that becomes comfortable with its own technology, like we are today, they lose sight of how to be this nomadic aspect where they can survive in the wild. Like we could never survive in the wild today. We don't have those skills anymore. So what happened? These cataclysms, or numerous cataclysms come through. These changes all around the world take place that are so violent that these sophisticated, advanced human civilizations were wiped out. And there were remnants of them that are still around, but the majority of them were wiped out. And what you had left were, at the same time, these coexisting nomadic, more indigenous people were on the planet, and they were the ones that had to then carry on the legacy. But they only had small connections to whoever had survived. And over time, each generation went by, these more primitive people who I believe who tried to rebuild things like Machu Picchu on top of these ancient structures. Even in places like the Maya and Aztec, you see that. But they just didn't have that information and knowledge. And so they started worshiping what they thought were these ancient gods from long ago, but they no longer had connections to them anymore. That's why they started becoming so focused and corrupted through blood sacrifice, and then identifying certain gods with things like the forces of nature and storms and things like that. So people see things like that and say, oh, this is a sun god or a storm god. Yeah. That's because over time, all of this information was being lost and confused, and they started just trying to worship everything that they thought were these gods, when in reality, some of them were just the forces of nature. Don't confuse those two things. They're interchanged. Whereas you see something like Enki is directly speaking to someone like Ziausudur Atrahasis, giving him direct commands. Clearly, that's not just some force of nature doing that, because he's giving him direct commands and information about things that were about to happen and how to survive. Okay, and that's what that story is all about. Mm-hmm. Is Atrahasis Ziausudur, he was called also. He was Noah, and he was essentially one of the only ones who survived some of these cataclysms because he was warned, because he was an ancient ancestor of Enki, and Enki wanted to protect that certain bloodline so it could continue long into the future. That's why we have so much confusion on this, on what's occurred here, because we have these different epics of humanity, these epics that have occurred, and the rise and fall of technologies. And after these happened, you had an attempt to reestablish them in places like Göbekli Tepe, but it was for nothing, because this time period featured multiple different time periods of destruction, and they were wiped out. So the reset occurred on multiple levels. And what we're left with today, to make a long story short, is what we're left with today are just these remnants and pieces that are left. That's it.